You'd struggle to find a list of the greatest Batman comics of all time that doesn't include The Dark Knight Returns. But does it deserve to be there? Or is it a little bit overrated? Woof woof! Hey guys, it's me Marcus, aka the Mad Dog, and we're back with another video. Written and illustrated by Frank Miller, the first issue of The Dark Knight Returns was published by DC Comics in February of 1986, with the fourth and final issue being released in June of the same year. And it's been 10 years since the Batman was last seen in Gotham City. In his absence, superheroes have been forced to either join up with the government or be hunted by them. Politicians have become more corrupt, crime's running rampant, and a group of teenagers has formed a deadly gang known as the Mutants. Honestly, it's a pretty bad time, but when a fateful robbery takes place in Crime Alley, Bruce Wayne will take on the mantle of the Batman once again and try to take back Gotham City as his own. But can the Dark Knight return to his former glory, or will he finally be awarded with the worthy death that he's been yearning for? When it comes to the art, this is a style that's really grown on me over the years, especially as my tastes have matured and developed, and I've had enough people on the internet tell me that I'm wrong. Now I really enjoy it because every time I just flick through this book, there's so many iconic scenes, there's just great works of art that I could just look at for minutes on end. I can't say hours because I've got other stuff that I need to be doing, but it's not overly polished, it's still got a sketchy rough look to it that I just really like and I don't get to see as often in modern comics. And I think that's what strikes me most about it, is just how authentic it feels, especially in comparison to, you know, that sequel. I love the lines and the softer look and the pastel palette that seems to contrast everything that we've got now. And I know that there's some detractors for this style who don't really appreciate what's going on, and you know, art is a subjective thing and each person's going to have their own opinion on it. But for me, this is a book that I now just really enjoy looking at, and I'm glad that I've got the Absolute Edition, even if it came with that sequel. It is chaotic and frantic, and I don't always think that it has the best flow when it comes to the panels. There are a couple of occasions where you're supposed to read down and then across, and it seems like the speech bubbles start on the wrong side of the page, but you know, I kind of work my way around it and it isn't really detrimental to the story that it's telling. And I guess it works well with the themes of the book. And one theme that I really noticed in this book was good versus evil. Now I'm just messing with you, I meant the influence of the media, just how much news is always shoved into your face, and just how many different opinions are that you just supposed to accept. You know, it's kind of like being on the TikTok homepage. But for the most part, this did work really well, and I think I'm going to touch on that a little bit more in the story section because there were some detriments to it. But in particular, I liked how there was all these closed panels. There'd sometimes be more than it felt like there was necessary, but then it really opened up when you've got a scene featuring Batman. It felt free, it felt like you could breathe, it felt like you could understand what was going on in the scene instead of being closed into what you were supposed to see. I know that sounds dumb because it's all what you're supposed to see, but when I was writing this script for this review, that made sense in my head. And because of that, I think it's what made so many of these pages memorable. Him soaring through the sky, or riding a horse, or kicking Superman in the face. It gave those a wow factor because of the sense of space, and it's something that I really appreciated when I went back and reviewed Watchmen. So it's interesting that these books came out at a similar time and they were giving very similar vibes despite doing it in a different way. Because Frank Miller was trying to do something different, he wasn't sticking to the regimented format of just having 9 panels on a page. Sometimes it would look a little bit broken, but it felt intentional and that everything was where it was supposed to be. Unlike The Dark Knight Strikes Again, where it looked like somebody just threw up on the page and went, yeah, good enough. But one thing that I do think is a love or hate aspect is the character models. Everybody is quite blocky, even the Joker, who's historically quite skinny, looks like me back in high school, but it's to the point where some of the characters look quite bloated. I don't mind the angular aspect, and I think it really helps set it apart from other Batman titles. But obviously here it's a lot more rugged, and I'd go as far as saying quite dirty. And in saying that, there are some occasions where it doesn't feel like the art's entirely consistent. And I do wonder how it would land with me if it wasn't in a title like The Dark Knight Returns, because I enjoy this story so much that I feel like I give it a free pass when some of the art isn't really up to scratch, where I might have picked up on that on other titles. For every great moment, there is one that evokes very visible confusion from me. Like the Joker might be sat in a room full of laughing heads that looks so flat that it looks more like a carpet than a crowd. Or the mutants might be fighting in so much mud that it just washes away any detail, and the page resembles what I can create after I've had too much pre-workout. And in a similar love or hate way, the palette is very particular. The colours don't really pop off the page, and it is dark and grim and dreary in a way that really fits the tone well. When I think of the colours, they seem to only use a specific few, and save the handful of brighter ones like the reds, the blues, the yellows for the really important characters. And I think that's what makes the final fight just so exciting, because it's so different from what we saw before, especially if I do compare it with Batman's fight against the mutant leader. However, what this style does best is build up. There's times when there's just multiple panels of lightning striking, and you know that something's happening behind it, but the suspense just keeps keeps building. Or the newscast going on some kind of spiel and you feel like it's just rambling, but then there's some great immediate punchline just after it. And in honesty, there's probably more that I could speak about with the art. There's probably techniques and stuff that I've just overlooked, but then again, I never really said that I was good at doing reviews. But if you've only read this once, or maybe you wrote it off because you've seen a few of the pages, I definitely recommend checking it out again. I know this book's been out for nearly 40 years now, and it isn't a style that's for everybody, but I do think it's worth a second look, and definitely if you can get it in the Absolute Edition, which you can pick up alongside other comics at the channel's sponsor, Organic Price Books. They've got great packaging, fast shipping, and amazing customer services, and if you use code WOOFWOOF, you'll get $2 off your order. And if you're ordering 3 or more books and you want them to be delivered together, make sure you use code WOOFWOOF, ship it together for 5% off your entire order. Don't worry, you can just copy and paste them from the description down below, and you can use these codes as many times as you like. Getting into the story now, and the first issue with this book, honestly, might be one of my favourite single issues in all of comics. I think it's damn near close to being perfect when it comes to the story. Sure, it's longer than a standard comic, but the opening's great, the stakes are clearly there, it tells me enough without telling me too much. You see him get pushed to his breaking point and finally just put on the cowl once again. There's not as many single issues that I can think of that have the same effect as the opening of this title. I don't know where I rank it amongst stuff like the silent issue in Daredevil by Bendis, or the silent issue in Batman and Robin by Peter J. Tomasi. Damn, it seems like I really don't like reading. If all 4 issues could have followed in the same vein, then this easily would have been my favourite Batman comic of all time. Unfortunately though, it's not all like that, and TDKR can often crumble under the weight of its own ambitions. This really would have benefited from more issues or just less pages in each one, but between the mutants, Joker, Two-Face, the Sons of Batman, Carrie Kelly, the stuff that's going on with Jim Gordon, Superman, and just everything else, it just feels like there's too much in here, and a lot of it doesn't get the time that it really needs to flesh out its own concept. On top of that, there's a lot of just weird stuff in here that hasn't really improved over time. There's the weird Nazi boob lady that just seems to be in here for the sake of showing a little bit of boob, which feels really weird that I'm complaining about seeing boobs. Or those child bombs that I still don't really understand. Yes, it might just be me being dumb. I think it might be something to do with Toymaster, who did appear in Luther, so I felt like I had a bit more of an understanding of who that character was. But it's still just weird that you had these flying babies that could emit poisonous gas, and I just didn't really understand what was going on. Because the first issue, even though it is in a dystopian future, it feels like it's really grounded, it's trying to tell a serious story, and it just feels like it's undermining itself and going a bit too juvenile, a bit too stupid in moments like that. And those are always the bits that I forget about, and unfortunately are the surprises for me every time I come back to this book. On top of that, even though I did praise it when I was talking about the art, I feel like the news sections really overstayed the welcome. I thought it was great at first in a way that was catching us up without needing a lot of monologue, even though that does feel a bit counterproductive considering that there's so much monologue in this. And it got across its point that Gotham's this place that nobody would want to live, it's full of crime, it's all grey, everybody's depressed. Wait, that kind of sounds like where I live now. But by the 4th issue, when there's already so many plot points in motion that I really want to see get fleshed out, and I've got a good grasp on what Gotham's like in this book, I wouldn't have minded a lot less of the news stuff and more focus on the ongoing plot. But don't get me wrong, there were still some gems of moments in those later news sections, but unfortunately those moments were few and far between the later that the book went on. And I think if you're somebody who doesn't like this aspect when you start reading it, it's really going to put a cloud over your entire reading experience. And yeah, speaking about the voices, there was a lot of monologue, and some of it was great and added to the book, but there was just too much of it. That seems to be my main issue with this book. I like a lot of what it does, it just doesn't know when to stop, which is something that I can relate to. But when it's just Bruce, it's fun because it's so macabre and he just wants to die, and not in the dreary way, but in the kind of like samurai code type of style. Having it follow just him, especially in those early issues, really built into this character study of who Bruce Wayne is. And when Gordon's monologue started coming in, I thought that was cool and it really reminded me a lot of Batman Year One. But then when Carrie started monologuing, it was at that point that I felt like this was getting a bit too much. And no, that's not just because I hate kids, but that didn't help, because then Joker did it, and Superman, and Alfred, and probably other characters that I forgot about, and like I said, it just became a bit too much. The Joker in particular, I felt him monologuing took away from his inclusion in the book. Knowing what he's thinking doesn't feel right to me. He's the character that, unless it's a super exceptional circumstance, we shouldn't know what's going on in his head. And it just didn't add much in the grand scheme of things. Also as well, I should probably mention this here, this is going to be one of those reviews where I sprinkle in story points throughout it, but I feel like this book's been out for so long that you probably already know the vast majority of what goes into it, so it's kind of okay for me to talk about it. In saying that, Superman's monologue was pretty much the same because he'd positioned him as an antagonist, and I didn't gain much from hearing his thoughts. It would have been better if Superman was just this character that all of a sudden we can't understand, we can't relate him to the person that we know. To give it credit though, the best scene with the narration was during the fight with the mutant leader. This whole scene was great. Having Batman narrate exactly what's going on, picking up on his opponent's weaknesses, understanding his own limitations and how to exploit them, all while still giving us a brutal fight. I loved having the young stallion going up against the old warrior in a way that just reminded me of the recent fight between Yuri Prohaska and Glover Teixeira. Actually, all the fights were top tier if I'm being honest. They felt weighty and calculated and brutal most of the time. Batman would just throw people through windows or break their arms or just throw a gas bomb at them, and he enjoyed it whilst he was doing it. Gordon's looming retirement was an interesting touch. I got the sense that he was being forced out the role, but this was all that he knew, and there was that nice scene at the beginning where he met up with Bruce, and it's clear that crime's just got to a level that he understands that he's never going to conquer it. And I also got a sense that he did want to be done with it all, at least until Batman returned. They also did a great job of making his replacement somebody that was realistically unlikable. It wasn't this complete tyrant, it was somebody that you could tell had their own motives, but in the same sense you still wanted Gordon back in the role. I also like the connection between Bruce and Carrie, and this is something that's gotten better the more times that I've read this, because I have read other books where Batman has lost to Robin and I understand just how much that hurt him, and Carrie brought back this sense of youthful joy in a book that's just so grim and dark. And she was also just really useful. I'm surprised how quickly she took to the role, and she was in this enough without really ever taking too much away from Bruce. This was still his story, which is what I liked about it most. Also, I recently rewatched The Incredibles before I cracked this open again, and there are a striking amount of parallels between the two. Former top tier superheroes in a world that's had the vigilantes outlawed by the government, desperately yearning to go back to that lifestyle despite the fact that the world's moved on from their time. That's something that I didn't appreciate when I was younger, mostly because I read this whilst I was still in high school and I didn't have like bills and a mortgage and have to worry about like rising energy costs and stuff like that. I would love now to go back to those younger days when I didn't have those worries, and that was exactly what I saw in Bruce. Except for, you know, he's got much more money than me. And I'm just glad that this book gave me those extra things that I could appreciate when I came back to it this time. What's also great about this book is the sense of consequence, because Jason Todd dying made Batman retire, which made crime rates spike, which meant that Batman returned, and then Joker broke his silence, and the mutants being disbanded resulted in subgroups being born. Every story beat in this title felt like it had a point, which just made it feel so dense and lived in. Despite my gripes about the news stuff and the monologue, when it comes to the story, it felt like it was never trying to waste me time. Again, I'm normally a dumb reader, but I couldn't help but notice characters going through a similar journey, of people trying to escape an image of themselves but then realising that that's who they're supposed to be. It's clear that Bruce was trying to do anything to chase the same thrill that he had when he was Batman, and then would get surgery so that physically he didn't appear as Two-Face, but that's who he still was. The Joker resorting to silence in his absence, Gordon realising that he didn't want to retire, and even Superman was presented as a character that he really didn't want to be and went on a bit of his own journey. I loved that rather than it being a book about people hating the fact that they're heroes and this is a destiny and blah 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 blah, it actually had a kind of weird sadistic joy to it. Although I do believe that the first issue is really where this peaks, there is still a lot of great moments scattered throughout the other three issues. And overall, I do think this holds up well today, and I would recommend it to a modern reader. But where it does falter a bit is when it comes to the politics, and even when I reviewed something like Daredevil by Charles Soule, which came out much more recently than The Dark Knight Returns, even that felt like it aged already quite badly because of the political allegories that it was trying to put into its book. I may sound like a bit of a hypocrite, but I think it actually works better in this book because it was trying to make Batman seem more mature and adult. So I do let it off a little bit in comparison to what I did when it came to Daredevil, but I do think this was just the next piece in the evolution rather than the final step, because since then we have had other books that have done a great mature Batman story without needing to resort to politics. Now I do want to talk about the ending because I do think it has a great build up. Don't worry, I'm not going to spoil anything just yet. It's no secret that Batman and Superman fight, and I do think that this is much better in terms of motivation. I don't know where I'd rank it amongst fights like the one that we saw in Batman Hush, because I really enjoyed that when I went back and reviewed it. But still, this is just great, and it feels like Batman built up to the moment that he wanted from the very beginning. But I can't really say much else about the ending without going into spoilers, so this is your final spoiler warning. If you don't want anything ruined, well, anything else ruined, I'd recommend skipping to the final verdict timestamp down below. But Batman faking his own death is something that I have mixed feelings about. This is one of the only stories where a superhero death would have felt really fitting and not something that would have been retconned about 3 issues later, especially after a battle with the most powerful being in the universe, and Batman had actually got the upper hand on him. It answered that age-old debate, even if I know a lot of people wouldn't agree with this, but I loved that Batman used his own mortality to win this fight. He can die, unlike this Superman who would have just had to have taken more of a beating. And I don't want to hear any of this politics about the fact that Superman was weakened because of the missile strike. You know, you come to fight on the day and you fight who's in front of you. And in saying that, everything about this fight was top notch. I think I preferred this over the fight with the mutant leader because it felt like Bruce had finally come into his own. It's funny that the mutant leader actually seemed to give him a bit of a tougher time, if I'm being honest. Maybe you could say that Superman was holding back because of the fact that they were friends, but I'm not buying that. And I love the build up to it. It felt like this was something inevitable that had to happen. You even had Clark and Bruce meeting up as just, you know, in the civilian way, talking about the fact that Bruce needs to calm down. A talk that a lot of people have given to me. And the fact that we see Clark in the most Disney-like, picturesque way, it looked like this should have been some kind of postcard. Him then burning a message into the ground, asking them where to meet. The military being forced to stand down just to let this happen. And I said earlier that there's a lot of great Batman vs Superman fights, but this one felt like it meant more because there was just so much going on. It wasn't just that Superman was under the influence of kryptonite or that they just met and they didn't really know who each other was. They've had years together. There's a lot of tension, still a lot of respect, and quite a bit of friendship between the two. And they were fighting because they had to, because they had a point to prove. But Bruce faking his own death to win did make sense in the grand scheme of things. I think the reason why I don't like it is because it meant that Batman continued living, and that meant that we got the Dark Knight Strikes again. The only other spoiler type thing that I want to talk about is Joker's death. And I think even though it feels like a bit of an underwhelming moment because some of the other fights that happen throughout this book, this also felt like something that had to happen. And I think because we got this scene, this is what solidifies it as a great Batman story. It is closure for these two characters that have been on this journey together. I do wish that they'd had a bit more of a fight together. It just felt like they were kind of just trying to kill each other, which is something that I did really like, but it wasn't really as exciting as some of the other fights. Yeah, you did have Batman stabbing him in the eye, which was, you know, pretty badass, and I don't know where that stands on his no-kill rule, but this was also the moment where I realised that I can be as petty as the Joker. Like, if I was in that situation, I probably would have snapped my own spine as well. And I think as the last act of the Joker, that is one of the most perfect things that he could have done. It really reminded me a lot of the end of Gotham City, and that these two are intertwined together, that the Joker doesn't want to kill Batman, and that he doesn't want to live in a world without him, which was, you know, pretty much the same message as Lego Batman, but it's done better in here. It's just like I said, it's a bit weird that this isn't the end of the book and it is Batman vs Superman. Even though it did give us a more exciting fight, it would have felt more poetic if this would have been the ending of the book. Especially alluding to the fact that Bruce might die, just having him sit there against his opponent that he's finally overcome. I don't know if that would have been a better ending for this. This is my final verdict. And The Dark Knight Returns is often said to be one of the greatest comics of all time, and the reason why the medium matured for a modern audience. I think that sentiment still holds weight, even if I do feel like this title trips over itself when it comes to its own ambitions. Often compared to Watchmen, I don't feel like Frank Miller's work is as cohesive start to finish as Alan Moore's was, but the difference is that this book is still damn entertaining. I need to be mentally prepared to read Watchmen, whereas I can pretty much flick through the first issue of this title any given time. And on this reading, it was like I was being reunited with an old friend that I hadn't seen for years. And I appreciated this book more now than every time that I've read it before. Do I think it's perfect? No. But for a story that explores the duality between Bruce Wayne and Batman and the reason why he needs to exist as the Dark Knight, especially in a Gotham like this, other titles have tried to replicate what Frank Miller has done, but very few have had the same amount of success. Sure, the art isn't for everyone, and it might not be for you, and it does sometimes try to do too much to the point where this book just feels cramped, but I still had a great time with this, despite the fact that hype can often kill a lot of the experience. That wasn't the case with The Dark Knight Returns, and I look forward to the next time that I read it, and I hope it just continues to improve every single time. I don't know if I put this on my where to start Batman, but I do think it's something that you get more out of the more that you know about the character. So I definitely recommend checking it out if you haven't done so before, or going back for a reread if it's been a few years. And because of that, I'm going to give it a very high score of 85%. Woof woof! So, that's the review. I'm losing my voice. Tell me what you thought about The Dark Knight Returns in the comment section below, or join us over on our Reddit page or /MadDogComic community. But until next time, just make sure that you stay safe and stay mad, all you dogs. Woof woof! See you at the next video.